Perhaps one of the most intriguing things to study in wildlife biology is relationships between predator and prey species. It's usually a very dynamic relationship. It's usually very difficult to actually figure out just what's happening in the system with the interactions between the two. Now, before we get going too far in, we need to define predation. And predation is just when one organism consumes all or part of another. And this is a really important relationship because it's the prime movers of energy through the food chain and the trophic pyramid. They're important in the ecology of populations that determine the mortality in prey and birth of new predators. Predation is also an important evolutionary force, and sometimes we see these arms races occurring between predator and prey, where we see the prey species maybe adapt to become either more elusive or less available to a predator species. For example, there's a snail that has developed a really thick, hard shell over time in order to avoid being eaten by fish and crabs. Well, at the same time, maybe a slight delay, you see the crabs developing larger and larger claws in order to be able to crush the snail species. So that's what we mean by kind of an arms race evolutionarily between the two, and the idea of the survival of the fittest coming into play here. So one of the most classic examples of dynamics between a predator and prey population is the Canada lynx and snowshoe hare. What you're looking here is a graph of trapping records out of the Hudson Bay Fur Company in the mid to late 1800s, early 1900s. And what they started to notice is that as they were able to trap more and more of the prey species, the hare, and just a few years later, they noticed an increase in the lynx population. Now, I should mention here, this graph is not a graph of the total population. It's a graph of how many animals were trapped. And that's indicative of if there's more animals on the landscape, there's more available to get into the trap. So it does follow the same pattern that you would have expected the total population to follow at that time. So we see here that as the prey species increases, there's a few years delay and the predator species increases, and then the prey declines and then the predator declines. Prey increases, predator increases. And they said, you know, this is a really interesting look at the relationship between these two species, and you start to ask yourself, well, what's the driver? We have certain systems that we consider to be top-down relationships where the predator is controlling the prey species. In others, we call it a bottom-up relationship where the prey species is controlling the predator species. And so they began to ask themselves, well, what really happens with predator-prey relationships? Is it the predator that's controlling the prey? And for a long time, that's what we thought. That's why we eliminated so many predators on the landscape. And to an extent, that's accurate, right? If you eliminate a predator on the landscape, you get more prey species. But what happens when you eliminate a prey species on a landscape? Well, like this graph shows, you're going to reduce the number of predators in the landscape. And truthfully, the answer is probably that rarely is it either a complete top-down or bottom-up situation. Instead, they really work to control each other. And in this case, you can throw in even more variables such as the food availability for the prey. So in further studies, they have found that as hare browse on willows and their population becomes higher and higher, the browsing pressure increases on the willows, and the willows develop this toxicity that makes them less palatable to the prey species. Less palatable to the hares. And so when that happens, the hares essentially run out of food and die. And when they die, the predator dies. So sometimes it's vegetation that's really at the crux of the whole situation. And rarely do we see a cycle as classic as the snowshoe hare and Canada lynx in Canada, and that's because most of our predators are not specialists. Most predators have kind of a diverse menu of choices. We'll talk more about that. I like this picture down here that has wolves and bears and probably some dead prey species, even some scavengers in it. Most predators can switch their diet if their primary source of food is unavailable. Predation is dynamic, and it's important to know that it's driven by a myriad of factors. One, energy requirements based on life cycle. So you will see animals needing to consume more energy at different times of the year. If the mother is pregnant, she may need to eat more. If she is lactating or trying to feed for her young, kill for her young and bring them food, her energetic requirements are much, much higher. You will see the requirements based on prey availability. What's available in the landscape may drive what the animals are eating at any time of the year. At the third one there, parentage or training, as predators typically are what we call altricial, where the young have an extended learning time from their parents. Their parents may have to hunt more to feed for them and to teach them how to hunt. And for the effects of other predators comes into play. A lot of our what we would consider top predators in an ecosystem really turn out to be more of scavengers than actual predators. Lions are a great example of this. They make hyenas do a lot of the work. Then they'll come in and steal their prey and not have to exert the energy to do the hunting themselves. Okay, so let's think about what a predator has to know in order to be successful. The first is how to locate prey. They need to figure out what they eat, where they're going to find it, and what that prey is going to look like. So for example, I call this a search image. And for a good way to think about it, I like to think about being at a sporting event with a friend or a family member that you came with, and you go to get a Coke or something from the stand. You come back and you're trying to find your friend, and you know that they had maybe a red hat on. So you're scanning the crowd for that red hat, and every other clue you're just passing by, you're just stopping at anything red. That would be having a search image for your friend. And predators will do the same thing. They've developed a very fine-tuned eye for their prey species. I spent a summer up in Yellowstone, and part of the job we got to survey wolves while we were up there, and we would sit on a hillside, and wolves blended in very, very well with their surroundings, and we'd sit there and scan and scan and scan and try and find them. And over the course of the summer, I got much better at being able to pick a wolf out on the landscape because I developed a search image for the size and shape of that animal. The other thing is that a predator will look for not only what it looks like, but what the behavior is, or searching for the habitat of the prey before actually searching for the prey themselves. The second thing a predator must know is how to capture their prey, which may include working with others, as we see in some of our larger cat species, learning where to strike or bite the prey, and that's an important way of kind of determining who might have killed an animal. Different predator species will attack different places on the animal that is killed. And the third is how to distinguish palatable prey from unpalatable prey. Basically, what prey tastes good, what prey might be toxic, which prey should we avoid. And this is one of the fastest forms of learning. 1 to 2 trials and they will learn what not to eat. And then the fourth, of course, you can't just find your prey, you have to kill the prey. And that might mean having specialized teeth, it might have specialized claws, it might have extra strong muscles in certain parts of the body. Now on the flip side, prey gets to try and avoid predation. And there are a variety of ways that they do this. One of the most interesting to me is really looking at their coloration. And cryptic coloration is really the general term for camouflage. And camouflage is really not a wildlife biology term. We use this idea of cryptic coloration. And that might be something like this little sand dab that has that's a fish, a flat fish that lays up against the sand and really blends in. You can hardly see where the outline of that fish is. Blending in like the pika, and blending in is really just a form of cryptic coloration. The thing that's interesting here is when you look at an animal outside of its environment, sometimes it's really hard to say, how does that blend in? And even just slightly subtle things like a little bit more red on the body or a little bit more gray on the body might cause it to blend in. And you can see that the modeling on the pika really matches the modeling of the rocks. Who would think that matching the lichen would help you survive? And then there's protective resemblance, where you look like your surroundings, but your surroundings might be detrimental to the predator species. So this is a thorn hopper that develops this little thorn-like process of its thorax. The thorax extends backwards and forms sort of a hood over the wings and abdomen, and then if predators do choose to come toward it, it can spring and jump quite far away from the thorn on the branch that it was mimicking. Couple other things to think about is counter shading. We see this in aquatic species and small mammals, where if you're looking at the prey species from underneath, they're light colored, which would match a sky above. If you're looking at the prey species from the sky down into the water, they're dark on top, which would match the darker bottom of the water. And the same thing goes for the ground. Although most of the time animals aren't viewed from underneath when they're on the ground, but they'll still see that counter shading, which will help with the shadowing effect and kind of break up the shadow as the predator's looking at the small mammal from above. Disruptive coloration is and a classic example is the zebras, where you'd think their stripes really aren't any way of camouflaging, and it can be. Lions are their primary predator, and they hunt in the evening when the sun is getting low and there's long shadows in the grass, and so these stripes do tend to blend in with those long shadows. But probably more effectively, the striping helps with disruptive coloration, where the animal, like the lion, has picked out the weakest member that it's trying to stalk and attack, and as it gets closer, the herd starts running in all directions, in which case the stripes kind of get really confusing in the eyes of the predator, and the predator loses sight of the animal that it was looking at. And then there's aposematic coloration, which is like a warning coloration. And we see this a lot with like poison dart frogs, where they're very, very brightly colored. They don't blend in at all. And in fact, it's like them saying, hey, don't eat me. I'm really toxic and you can see me, so don't make the mistake of eating me. Similar, we get this mimicry where we have an aposematic warning coloration, like in the coral snake here, and predators know not to eat it because of this brightly colored poisonous animal, and we get a non-poisonous animal like the king snake that mimics the coloration of the coral snake in order to kind of ride the defenses of the coral snake so they don't get eaten, because you don't want to make that mistake and actually attack a coral snake if you thought it was a king snake. And then, and we have two types of mimicry. What I just described with the coral snake and king snake is something called Betazine mimicry, where they're a harmless species replicating a poisonous species. And then Molarin mimicry is where two equally toxic species might mimic each other, and it's kind of mutually beneficial for them to do so. And so you may see like a monarch butterfly or a viceroy on the right here that are both foul tasting, and it's to their advantage to have more of their look on the landscape, so that the mistake that a predator might make once of tasting something that isn't good for them or tastes really bad, they've done that once and they won't do it again. So if more of them look alike, then more of them survive. Now, this idea of mimicry is not just with prey species. It's really fascinating to look at how predators might have mimicry too. There is the alligator snapping turtle that when it opens its mouth, it has a little growth on its tongue that looks like a fish, or it looks like a worm to lure a fish into its mouth. So it'll sit there in the rock crevices blending in with its mouth open, this little bait inside, a fish comes in and chomp, it's gone. There's all kinds of different examples. There's a katydid that will mimic the sound that the prey species makes and lure it in. Like, hey, I'm one of you. It's really fun. You can look that up at different ways that predators provide mimicry to capture their prey. We're going to stop there before we get into other forms of defenses, and we'll wrap it up in the next slideshow or in the next video.